Union Carbide stands as the 20th century's clearest example of breathtaking industrial ambition and its catastrophic human cost. For a brief time, to mention its name was to evoke the staggering power of applied chemistry, a fortune built on the very molecules of modern life. This chemical empire was founded in 1917 as the Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation. It began by consolidating companies making simple products, carbon for batteries and acetylene gas for lamps, but rose to become one of the most powerful and diversified chemical giants on Earth, mastering industrial gases, plastics, and pesticides. For much of the 20th century, Union Carbide shaped the infrastructure of global industry. A clear example was its Ever-Easy battery division, which powered the world, and its plastics division, which created household staples like Glad bags. Its influence reached the highest levels of government, partnering with NASA to provide rocket propellant and with the U.S. military to produce the notorious defoliant Agent Orange. Its colossal wealth was staggering. At its 1984 peak, the corporation reported revenues of $9 billion, the equivalent of over $28 billion today, and employed 100,000 people worldwide. This money funded aggressive global expansion, cutting-edge research, and a powerful lobbying machine that influenced chemical regulations across the globe. But unlike the enduring Rockefeller or DuPont dynasties, Union Carbide's legacy was not to be defined by its innovations, but by a single catastrophic collapse. Its history was marked by ruthless robber baron, cost-cutting, systemic safety failures, and accusations of environmental racism. And most infamously, the Bhopal disaster of 1984, which unleashed a cloud of deadly gas that killed over 15,000 people and injured 500,000 in one night. This blow shattered the company's reputation, buried it in litigation, and ultimately led to its corporate evaporation as it was acquired and dissolved by Dow Chemical. This is a costly lesson in how quickly the promise of better living through chemistry can become a global nightmare. Union Carbide's dark past and the origins of the chemical industry. Union Carbide's ascent was fueled by war and a ruthless exploitation of both people and the planet, long before the world had ever heard of Bhopal. Digging into the corporation's origins feels like excavating a toxic dump. The deeper you go, the darker the history becomes. Its very DNA was formed in 1917 from a merger of four companies: National Carbon, Lind Air Products, Presto Light, and the original Union Carbide, perfectly timed to profit from World War I. Historical documents confirm it became a key supplier of hazardous materials for the war effort, including the horrific poison gases, mustard gas, and phosgene, establishing an early and lucrative pattern of prioritizing government contracts over moral qualms. But if war forged the company, its domestic operations revealed a chilling disregard for human life. The 1930s Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster in West Virginia stands as one of the worst industrial tragedies in American history. Desperate for work during the Great Depression, a workforce of mostly black migrant laborers was sent to drill a tunnel through Silica Rock. According to studies by West Virginia University and subsequent congressional hearings, Union Carbide, which managed the project, failed to provide even the most basic ventilation or respiratory protection. Workers emerged from the tunnels caked in white dust, only to die slow, agonizing deaths from acute silicosis. It's estimated that at least 476 men perished, though some reports place the toll closer to 1,000. The company's response was to settle lawsuits quietly and move on. This pattern of profiting from toxicity and then managing the fallout became a core business strategy. The company became a primary manufacturer of Agent Orange, the dioxin-laced defoliant used by the U.S. military to devastating effect in Vietnam. The horrific legacy of birth defects and cancers affecting millions in Vietnam and American veterans alike led to a massive class action lawsuit in 1984, which UCC and other manufacturers settled for $180 million. Simultaneously, its Caledria insulation products laced with asbestos were causing rampant mesothelioma, leading to hundreds of millions in liability claims. To sanitize this toxic history, Union Carbide became a pioneer of modern public relations. It launched its famous reassuring slogan, "Better things for better living," through chemistry, sponsoring environmental research, and publicly collaborating with the EPA. This carefully crafted facade of a benign progressive innovator was designed to bury any mention of its darker deeds. But as internal documents from the 1970s and 80s would later show, the real strategy was unchanged: maximize profit, minimize safety costs, and manage the public perception. This was the corporate culture that, in 1969, turned its sights on a poor, densely populated city in the heart of India, the perfect business model that built a bomb. The rise of Union Carbide from the 1960s to the early 1980s was not a simple story of corporate growth. It was a calculated masterpiece of market domination, vertical integration, and a new, ruthless form of regulatory arbitrage. If the post-war era built the foundation, these 2 decades built the empire. This was the zenith. This was the period when Union Carbide's name, broadcast across television sets and stamped on household goods, became synonymous with American ingenuity. But behind this public facade, the corporation was pioneering a set of aggressive and ultimately fatal business tactics that would cement its power and, in the process, plant the seeds of its own destruction. To understand the colossus that Union Carbide became, one must first look at its sheer market dominance. By the 1980s, the company wasn't just a player in the chemical industry. In many sectors, it was the industry. The most visible tentacle of this empire was its consumer products division, anchored by the iconic Ever E80 battery. As detailed in chemical industry reports from the era, Union Carbide controlled a staggering 25% of the entire U.S. battery market. The Ever E80 cat with the 9 lives was a fixture in every American home, powering flashlights, radios, and the first wave of portable electronics. It was a license to print money, a stable, high-visibility cash cow that funded the corporation's more volatile and ambitious industrial ventures. But the batteries, while profitable, were merely the friendly face of a much larger, more intimidating industrial beast. Where Carbide truly dominated was in the unseen, unglamorous, and utterly essential building blocks of the modern world. Take, for example, ethylene glycol. To the average person, the name meant nothing. But to the automotive industry, it was the lifeblood of antifreeze. Union Carbide produced 15% of the entire global supply of the chemical. Its control over this single compound meant that millions of cars, trucks, and industrial engines across the world, from Detroit to Dusseldorf, depended on a Union Carbide product to function. This dominance was fortified by a deep symbiotic relationship with the U.S. government. While rivals were bidding on commercial contracts, Union Carbide was aiming higher. According to company histories, it secured high-prestige contracts with NASA, developing specialized industrial gases and propellants for the rockets that carried men to the moon. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a PR coup. It positioned Union Carbide not as a mere chemical manufacturer, but as a patriotic partner in America's manifest destiny, pushing the boundaries of science. This patriotic sheen provided a powerful shield against criticism and regulatory scrutiny. The financial results of this strategy were breathtaking. By 1984, on the very eve of its downfall, Union Carbide posted revenues of $9.5 billion. To put this figure in perspective, it was an amount that rivaled the gross domestic product of entire nations. The company was a global power in its own right, a testament to a strategy that was as brilliant as it was brutal. That strategy rested on two core pillars: relentless vertical integration and the exploitation of new, unregulated markets. The first pillar, vertical integration, was Union Carbide's primary weapon. In the 1980s, financial analysts noted that UCC's profit margins were consistently and inexplicably higher than its chief competitors, Dow and Monsanto. The reason was simple. Union Carbide didn't just assemble products, it controlled every single step of the manufacturing process, from the ground to the consumer. While its competitors had to buy their raw materials, the plastics, the solvents, the precursor chemicals, on the open market, Union Carbide was the market. It owned the mines that produced the ores. It owned the chemical plants that refined those ores into industrial gases. It owned the factories that used those gases to synthesize complex plastics and chemicals. And it owned the distribution networks that brought the final product to market. It was a perfect closed loop of profit. This model gave them a terrifying competitive advantage. Financial analyses from the 1980s, later scrutinized during litigation, concluded that this integration slashed their production costs by as much as 30% compared to rivals. They could bleed Dow and Monsanto dry in a price war without ever breaking a sweat. This strategy was exemplified in its pesticide division. Union Carbide didn't just sell the pesticide 7, it built a one-of-a-kind high-tech plant in Bhopal, India, to manufacture its hyper-toxic precursor chemical, methyl isocyanate, MIC. This control over the choke point chemical meant they controlled the entire pesticide market that depended on it. But it was the second pillar of their strategy, emerging market expansion, that truly defined the company's hubris and led directly to the gates of hell. In the 1970s, a new threat emerged in America, the environmental movement. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the passage of landmark legislation like the Clean Air Act of 1970 suddenly meant that disposing of toxic waste was no longer as simple as dumping it in a river or venting it into the air. Compliance was expensive. It cut into profits. Union Carbide's solution was simple. If the rules in America are too expensive, go where there are no rules. The corporation's gaze turned to the developing world, a vast untapped frontier where the environmental anxieties of the West had not yet taken root. India and Brazil became primary targets. To governments desperate for modernization, Union Carbide presented itself as a savior. It promised jobs. It promised new technology. In India, it promised to fuel the green revolution, providing the pesticides that would allow the nation to finally feed its billion-strong population. It was a seductive sales pitch, and India bought it completely. The deal was struck. Union Carbide would build its state-of-the-art pesticide plant in the central Indian city of Bhopal. In exchange, it received massive tax breaks, cheap land, and a tacit understanding that it would be allowed to operate with minimal government interference. The Bhopal plant, officially run by the 51% owned subsidiary Union Carbide, India Limited, UCIL, was a crown jewel of this new global strategy. It was a massive success. By 1980, the plant was licensed to produce 5,000 tons of MIC-based pesticide per year, and UCIL had captured 50% of India's entire pesticide market. This strategy, however, was built on a deliberate and fatal double standard. The company assured the Indian government that the Bhopal plant was built to the same exacting specifications as its sister plant in Institute, West Virginia. This was a lie. An explosive internal UCC report from 1982, just 2 years before the disaster, confirmed the horrifying truth. The American plant was heavily regulated, featuring computerized safety systems, robust backup controls, and emergency plans coordinated with local authorities. The Bhopal plant, by contrast, was built on the cheap. It relied on manual rather than automatic systems. It lacked effective cooling systems for its toxic chemicals. It had no computerized warning system. The safety standards, in short, were consciously designed to be inferior. The company used local labor, but it intentionally withheld its first-world safety technology. The message was clear. American lives in West Virginia were worth the investment in safety. Indian lives in Bhopal were not. This double standard was not merely a design flaw. It was the central pillar of Union Carbide's emerging market strategy. The 1982 internal report, which landed on the desks of executives in both India and the U.S. headquarters in Danbury, Connecticut, was not a surprise. It was a confirmation of corporate policy. The report, conducted by an American team of safety experts, was a terrifying inventory of systemic failure. It listed leaking valves, faulty instruments, and a complete lack of emergency preparedness. It stated in no uncertain terms that the plant was a severe risk. The response from management was not to halt operations and fix the problems. The response was to file the report. This decision can only be understood in the context of the economic climate of the early 1980s. A global recession was in full swing, and Union Carbide, despite its massive revenues, was feeling the pressure. The company had diversified aggressively, notably with the 1980 acquisition of Vistron, a company specializing in ammonia. This move, intended to further solidify their control over the agricultural chemical market, had instead saddled the corporation with a staggering $2 billion in debt by 1984. Shareholders were restless. Wall Street analysts were skeptical. The pressure from Danbury to cut costs, not by percentages but by whole divisions, was immense, and the Bhopal plant was a prime target. The Green Revolution in India had stalled. A series of droughts and economic slumps meant that the demand for Savin pesticide had plummeted. The massive Bhopal factory, built to produce 5,000 tons a year, was operating at a fraction of its capacity. It was no longer a crown jewel. It was a financial hemorrhage. And so the cost-cutting directives that began as a design philosophy became a daily operational mandate. This was not negligence born of ignorance. It was a calculated top-down strategy of managed decay. The most critical cuts were made to the workforce. The 1982 safety audit had already warned that staffing levels were dangerously low. Management's response was to cut them further. The vital night shift, responsible for monitoring 42 tons of one of the deadliest chemicals on Earth, was slashed from 14 operators to just 6. But the numbers alone don't tell the story. The training of these operators was systematically dismantled. When the plant first opened, operators were sent to the sister plant in West Virginia, receiving 6 months of rigorous hands-on training. By 1983, this program was deemed too expensive. New hires were given just 15 days of classroom instruction. To make matters worse, the training manuals were often photocopies of the West Virginia plant's manuals. Diagrams that, in many cases, did not even match the cheaper manually operated equipment installed in Bhopal. And, in a final act of colonial arrogance, this highly technical material was often presented only in English, a language many of the new, low-wage hires barely understood. They were being trained to operate a ticking time bomb with the wrong instructions. With a skeleton crew of poorly trained operators, the next tactic was to dismantle the physical safety systems themselves. These systems were the only line of defense against a runaway reaction. Union Carbide turned them off, one by one, to save pocket change. The company's business tactic was to treat safety as an optional line item expense. First, they targeted the flare tower. This was the last-ditch failsafe, a tower designed to ignite and burn off any massive leak of toxic gas before it could reach the city. But the flare required a pilot light and fuel. To save money, the flare was not just turned off, it was physically disconnected. A crucial section of pipe was removed for maintenance and never replaced. It stood against the Bhopal sky as a useless, hollow metal sculpture. Second, they neutered the vent gas scrubber. This device was designed to neutralize any leaking MIC by spraying it with a caustic soda solution, but the system was notoriously unreliable and expensive to run. So, it was shut down and left on standby mode. This meant that even if an operator managed to activate it during a panic, it would be too late. The caustic soda pumps were off. The chemical itself was often not at the correct concentration. The scrubber was, for all intents and purposes, dead. Finally, and most damningly, was the refrigeration unit. The science of MIC is simple and terrifying. It is stable only when kept near freezing, 0 degrees Celsius. If it warms up, it begins to polymerize, triggering a chain reaction that generates immense heat and pressure. The refrigeration unit, a massive chiller that circulated Freon around the MIC storage tanks, was the single most important piece of safety equipment at the plant. In June of 1984, management shut it down. The official reason was to save money on maintenance and electricity. The estimated savings, later revealed in court documents, were $50 a day. For the price of a modest business lunch in Danbury, Union Carbide's leadership disconnected the life support system on its chemical bomb. They decreed that the 42 tons of MIC would simply be stored at ambient temperature. In the brutal summer heat of central India, this meant the chemical was baking at over 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, existing in a constant state of pre-runaway. This trio of decisions, no flare, no scrubber, no refrigeration, was not an accident. It was a business tactic. It was the physical manifestation of a corporate strategy that had already been battle-tested in American courtrooms. While UCC was dismantling its Bhopal plant, it was simultaneously engaged in a series of high-stakes legal brawls back home. These cases show a clear pattern of managing toxicity as a public relations problem, not a human one. The Agent Orange lawsuit, filed by 291,000 American veterans, reached its climax in 1984. UCC and the other manufacturers settled for $180 million. Crucially, they admitted no liability. The message was clear. Chemical warfare and its consequences had a price tag, and it was a manageable one. This followed decades of asbestos litigation over their Caledria products. The company's tactic here was to obfuscate, delay, and fight jurisdiction, arguing that the subsidiaries who sold the asbestos were separate legal entities. This was the same legal firewall they were building around UCIL in India. These weren't just lawsuits, they were training exercises. They taught the corporation that catastrophe was survivable, that human life had a quantifiable cost, and that legal firewalls could protect the parent company from the sins of the sub-psi. The 1970s antitrust case with DuPont, which UCC settled out of court, had taught them how to avoid public scrutiny and maintain market control. This was the complete Union Carbide business model in 1984. It was a three-pronged assault. First, financial dominance through vertical integration and debt-fueled acquisitions. Second, operational ruthlessness through regulatory arbitrage, building double-standard plants in poor nations, and then stripping them of all safety measures to service the debt. Third, legal insulation, using a fortress of subsidiaries, out-of-court settlements, and jurisdictional challenges to treat the inevitable human cost as a simple line item on a balance sheet. The rise of Union Carbide was not the story of a company that had an accident. It was the story of a company whose entire business model was the accident, waiting to happen. The complex machinery of the corporation, from its boardrooms in Connecticut to its leaking valves in India, was primed for a single purpose: to protect profits at all costs. As the suffocating hot night of December 2nd, 1984, descended on Bhopal, the machine was working perfectly. The final warnings in Bhopal. This lethal business model, perfected in American courtrooms and remote mountain tunnels, was not just a theoretical strategy. It was an active daily operational plan inside the Bhopal factory throughout the early 1980s. The 1982 internal safety audit, the one that listed a catastrophic array of failures, was the definitive turning point. It was the moment the corporation's two competing philosophies, publicly stated safety and privately mandated cost-cutting, met in a final, head-on collision. The cost-cutters won. That 1982 report, conducted by the American safety team from Danbury, was an X-ray of a dying patient. It confirmed that the plant's design was not just inferior to its West Virginia counterpart, but that it was being operated in a state of managed decay. The report cited leaking valves, corroded pipes, non-functional instruments, and a serious potential for a runaway reaction in the MIC storage tanks. It was a formal internal declaration that the plant was a time bomb. The response from Union Carbide's U.S. headquarters was the final fatal business tactic. The report was not a call to action. It was a liability to be contained. According to subsequent investigations and legal discovery, the telexes that flew between India and Danbury in the wake of that report tell the whole story. The American executives received the warnings, but they also received the bleak financial reports from UCIL. The Indian operation was losing money. The pesticide market had collapsed. Therefore, management approved only those repairs that were deemed absolutely essential and would not incur a major cost. The leaking valves on the MIC storage tanks, the very ones the audit had flagged, were not considered essential. They were, in the cold calculus of the balance sheet, a deferrable expense. The corporation, having received a full, detailed map of the coming disaster, chose to file it away. This decision gave the local plant managers in Bhopal the only directive they needed: cut deeper, and so they did. The plant itself began to cannibalize its own safety systems. The skeleton crew, already untrained, was now forced to operate a failing facility. When a critical pressure gauge broke, it was not replaced. Instead, operators were told to simply walk outside and read the dial on the tank itself, a dial that was often inaccurate and, in an emergency, lethally inaccessible. When spare parts for leaking valves were needed, they were often unavailable, as the warehouse budget had been frozen. The tactic was to make do. A plant designed for 5,000 tons of production was now a limping, leaking shell, and the workers knew it. This is where the corporation's strategy of legal insulation began to fail. The workers, unlike the marginalized and transient workforce at Hawk's Nest, were unionized. They were local. They had families in the Bastilles, the slums, that pressed right up against the factory wall. They could smell the leaks. They saw their colleagues getting sick, and they began to fight back. The local operators union wrote letters, pleaded with management, and finally, in a desperate act, began to paste posters around the city of Bhopal. These posters warned in stark, terrifying detail of the dangers inside. They listed the chemicals. They warned of a potential catastrophe. They begged the public to pay attention. The corporation's response was a tactic taken directly from its 50-year-old playbook: deny, delay, and intimidate. Management branded the union leaders as troublemakers, as radicals trying to scare the public. They told the local government that the union was simply a negotiating tactic, that the plant was safe, and that Union Carbide's world-class technology was in control. They were not just ignoring their own auditors. They were now actively silencing their own operators. And then came the journalist. His name was Rajkumar Keswani, a local reporter at a small newspaper. He saw the union's posters. He spoke to the frightened workers, and he began to investigate. In 1982, 2 years before the disaster, Keswani published the first of a series of articles that would become his life's Cassandra-like burden. His headlines were not subtle. One read, "Bhopal, sitting on the mouth of a volcano." Another pleaded, "Wake up, people of Bhopal." He detailed with chilling accuracy everything the internal audit had said. He described the MIC. He described the non-existent safety systems. He interviewed workers who told him it is not a matter of if this plant has a disaster, but when. He described in print exactly how the disaster would happen. He sent his articles to the state's chief minister. He sent them to the Indian parliament. He even sent them to Union Carbide's headquarters. He was ignored. The local government, enamored with the prestige and tax revenue of a multinational corporation, dismissed him as a sensationalist. The company dismissed him as a nuisance. The business tactic of containment was working. While Keswani was publishing his warnings, the plant was providing the physical evidence. It began to conduct its own dress rehearsals for the apocalypse. In 1981, a phosgene gas leak, phosgene being a chemical precursor to MIC and itself a deadly poison gas used in World War I, killed a plant worker named Mohammed Ashraf. The company's response was pure Hawk's Nest: a quiet investigation, a small payout to the family, and a public assurance that the isolated incident was resolved. Then in October 1982, another leak. This time, a mixture of MIC and other chemicals burst from a faulty valve, injuring 4 workers and sending a small acrid cloud over the nearby slums, causing panic. Again, the company managed the public relations. They assured the city it was a minor event, but internally, they knew the truth. They knew the systems had failed. These rehearsals were the final screaming alarms. They were proof that the 1982 audit was correct. They were proof that the union was correct. They were proof that Rajkumar Keswani was correct. And they were the final opportunity for the corporation to reverse its deadly strategy. Instead, in the face of 2 years of internal audits, public warnings, and real-world gas leaks, Union Carbide made its final business decision. The plant was barely producing pesticide anymore. The most logical and safest course of action would have been to drain the massive 42-ton storage tank, Tank 610. The MIC could have been passivated or made inert, or it could have been stored, as it was in West Virginia, in hundreds of small, individual refrigerated steel drums, making a large-scale runaway reaction impossible. But both of those options were expensive. They required labor. They required materials. They required caring. The cheapest, easiest option was to do nothing. The cheapest tactic was to leave 42 tons of one of the planet's most volatile poisons sitting in a single massive, unrefrigerated, unmonitored leaking tank and hope for the best. This was the ultimate expression of the Union Carbide business model. The rise of the corporation was complete. It had built a global empire by pioneering a strategy that perfected the art of profiting from risk while transferring the cost in human lives to the most vulnerable people it could find. By the last week of November 1984, the machine was set. The refrigeration was off. The flare tower was disconnected. The scrubber was empty. The skeleton crew was untrained. And inside Tank 610, the poison was quietly, patiently beginning to warm up. The river of death and the cyanide a sly. It began just after midnight on December 3rd, 1984. Inside Tank 610, the runaway reaction, which had been building for hours, became unstoppable. The 42 tons of liquid MIC, now boiling at over 200 degrees Celsius, transformed into a massive volume of pressurized gas. The pressure inside the tank exceeded all limits, finally buckling the concrete and steel. At approximately 12:40 a.m., the emergency safety valve burst. A scalding, dense cloud of pure poison erupted from the top of the MIC structure, shooting over 100 feet into the cool night air. For the next 2 hours, the tank bled. It hemorrhaged a lethal plume of 27 tons of methyl isocyanate, along with its even deadlier chemical byproducts, hydrogen cyanide and phosgene. The gas was heavier than air. It did not disperse. Instead, it clung to the ground, becoming a dense white river of death. It flowed south, pushed by a gentle breeze, moving silently over the factory walls and into the sleeping city. The first to be hit were the Busties, the squatter settlements of Jayaprakash Nagar and Kazi Camp, whose flimsy tin and canvas walls pressed directly against the factory's perimeter. These were the homes of the city's poorest, the rickshaw pullers, the day laborers, the street sweepers. Many of them were the families of the low-wage workers Union Carbide had hired. The gas was an invisible killer. Survivors, in later testimony, described the initial sensation not as a smell, but as a taste, a sharp, metallic, peppery taste that suddenly filled their mouths. It was immediately followed by a blinding, searing pain in their eyes, as if acid had been thrown in their faces. Then came the lungs. The gas, upon contact with the moisture in the body, hydrolyzed into a powerful acid, burning through the respiratory tract. Panic erupted in the darkness. People awoke choking, their lungs filling with fluid. They were drowning on dry land. Families, blinded and suffocating, burst from their homes. But where could they run? The gas was everywhere. The streets became a scene of apocalyptic chaos. Men, women, and children collapsed in heaps, their bodies convulsing. The air was filled with the sounds of screaming, vomiting, and a terrible rasping cough as people desperately tried to draw a breath that was no longer there. The gas flowed into the main city, rolling through the railway station. In the waiting rooms, hundreds of sleeping travelers and homeless families were enveloped. Many never woke up. They died in their sleep, their bodies found days later, frozen in the positions they had last held. A train, the Gorakhpur-Mumbai Express, pulled into the station at the height of the leak. The gas poured through the open windows of the carriages. The passengers inside began to choke. The station master, trying to send a warning up the line, collapsed and died at his desk. The city's main medical facility, Hamidia Hospital, was hit next. The toxic cloud settled over the building, seeping into the emergency rooms. Doctors and nurses, suddenly blinded by the same burning pain as their patients, found themselves choking as they tried to work. They had no idea what was happening. The first wave of victims began to arrive, carried by relatives or stumbling in on their own. They were blind, hysterical, and suffocating. The doctors were completely unprepared. They had never been told what Union Carbide was storing at the plant. They didn't know what MIC was. They did not know what the antidote was. They began treating for asthma, for tuberculosis, for anything they could think of. They administered eye drops and injected steroids. But the people kept dying right in front of them, on the hospital floors, in the hallways, on the lawn outside. By dawn, the immediate catastrophe was over. The gas had largely dissipated, leaving a chemical stench and a profound, terrible silence. The city of Bhopal looked like a battlefield. The official, immediate death toll, as counted by the government, was 2,259. But this number was a clinical fiction. The streets were littered with the dead. Bodies of men, women, and children were piled on pushcarts, on bicycles, on the backs of rickshaws, all heading for the hospitals and morgues. The city's infrastructure completely collapsed. There were not enough shrouds. There was not enough wood for the funeral pyres. Mass graves were dug. Mass cremations were held, with hundreds of bodies burned at once. The human toll was just beginning. The true number of immediate deaths is estimated to be closer to 8,000. In the surrounding countryside, a different kind of death occurred. The gas had settled on the fields and water sources. Thousands of cattle, goats, and buffaloes lay dead, their bodies grotesquely bloated. The city's food and water supply was poisoned. This was the scene that greeted the world on the morning of December 3rd. This was the Chernobyl of Asia. The immediate reaction from Union Carbide India Limited, the men who ran the plant, was a masterclass in the tactics the parent company had taught them. Their first instinct was not to help, but to lie. As the gas was still leaking, a plant manager spoke to the press. He stated categorically, "The gas leak is not from our plant. There is no problem here." When that lie became untenable as thousands of dead bodies piled up outside their gates, the story changed. A public relations officer for UCIL, in a statement that would become infamous, told the panicked city, "The gas is not fatal. It is only a minor irritant." This was the first act of the corporate response: deny and minimize. As the sun rose over a city of the dead, the news of the disaster spread across the globe. In Danbury, Connecticut, in the sterile, carpeted headquarters of Union Carbide Corporation, the telex reports that clicked in were not of human suffering, but of a catastrophic production failure. The immediate corporate response was not one of humanitarian aid. It was one of legal and financial damage control. The man at the center of this was the corporation's chairman and CEO, Warren Anderson. Anderson was the embodiment of the modern, polished, and insulated executive. He was a man who, until that morning, had likely never thought of the Bhopal plant as anything more than a single underperforming asset on a global balance sheet. Now, it threatened to sink his entire empire. His first move was a calculated public relations gamble. He announced he would fly to India immediately to personally assess the damage and lead the relief efforts. To the American media, it was presented as an act of profound corporate responsibility, of a captain refusing to abandon his ship. But to legal experts, it was an act of inexplicable hubris, walking directly into the scene of a mass crime for which his company was responsible. On December 7th, just 4 days after the leak, Warren Anderson's corporate jet landed in Bhopal. He was met not as a savior, but as a criminal. He and the senior leadership of UCIL were immediately arrested by the Indian police. The charge filed by the local authorities was culpable homicide, the equivalent of manslaughter. For a few brief, shocking hours, the world witnessed something that had never happened before. A powerful American CEO was in custody, his passport seized, held responsible for the actions of his corporation. It was the first and last moment of true accountability. The arrest was pure theater, but the release was a brutal display of real power. Anderson was held for only 6 hours. The phone lines between New Delhi and Washington, D.C. burned. High-level diplomatic pressure was applied. The Indian central government, terrified of angering a major U.S. investor, and the U.S. government itself intervened. Anderson was released on a paltry $2,000 bail, driven under full police escort back to his private jet, and flown out of the country. He would never return. He would never, for the rest of his life, face an Indian court, despite being a wanted fugitive. His brief 6-hour arrest was a public relations coup. He had fulfilled his promise to go. He could now claim he had tried to help, but was instead politicized and prevented by a chaotic foreign government. He returned to the safety of Danbury, where the real corporate reaction could begin. With Anderson safely back in America, Union Carbide launched its second and most cynical line of defense. They could no longer deny the leak, so they would deny the cause. They would invent a new narrative. This narrative was the sabotage theory. While the Indian government's scientists and its own internal auditors were concluding the disaster was a direct result of the shut-down safety systems and the fatal cost-cutting, Union Carbide's American PR team, along with their legal counsel, crafted a different story. They claimed the disaster was not an accident at all, but a deliberate act of sabotage by a disgruntled employee. This theory, which the company would fund and promote for the next 20 years, was as brilliant as it was baseless. It alleged that a single unnamed worker, angry at management, had intentionally and maliciously connected a water hose directly to the MIC tank, bypassing all safety protocols, with the specific intent to destroy the factory. This story was a legal and moral shield. It masterfully shifted the blame from a provable, documented, long-term systemic failure of design, policy, and management for which the U.S. parent company was responsible, to a single, unforeseeable criminal human act for which they were not. It painted Union Carbide not as the perpetrator, but as a fellow victim of a terrible crime. While this narrative was being crafted for the media, the third phase of the reaction began, the legal battle. Union Carbide's lawyers immediately moved to block any and all lawsuits filed by victims in the United States. Their argument was a legal doctrine known as forum nonconvenience, or inconvenient forum. They argued that an American court was not the proper place to hear the case. They insisted that the matter must be tried in India, the very country whose legal system and government they had just bypassed to extract their CEO. It was a strategy to ensure that any settlement would be calculated based on Indian, not American, standards of living. It was a tactic to guarantee that the value of a dead Indian citizen would be a tiny fraction of the value of a dead American one. While this three-pronged reaction, Anderson's escape, the sabotage theory, and the legal blockade, was unfolding, the victims in Bhopal were left to deal with the consequences. The philanthropic response from UCC was minimal. The company, which had reported $9 billion in revenue, made an initial offer of just $2 million in interim relief, a figure that was insulting. The victims were now fighting a war on two fronts. In Bhopal, they were fighting for their next breath, for clean water, and for medical care for their dying children. And in the courtrooms of New York and New Delhi, they were fighting a legal battle against a faceless corporation that had already decided Their lives were a manageable expense. The sabotage theory was more than just a legal strategy. It was an act of profound psychological warfare against the victims. It not only denied them justice, but it also poisoned their own community by suggesting one of their own was the faceless monster responsible, absolving the distant corporation entirely. While Union Carbide's lawyers and public relations firms in New York were spending millions to promote this narrative, the doctors at Hamidia Hospital were fighting a medieval battle in a cloud of chemical ignorance. The central agonizing question in the chaos of those first days was, what is the antidote? The doctors in Bhopal were desperate. They saw the symptoms, the blindness, the pulmonary edema, the convulsions, but they were treating them blind. They knew the gas was from Union Carbide, so they pleaded with the company for medical information. What was MIC? How did it kill? And how could they stop it? The response from Union Carbide was the final unforgivable betrayal. The company's medical division from its headquarters in Danbury actively withheld and obfuscated the truth. From the first telexes, Union Carbide's doctors insisted that MIC was only a lung irritant. They claimed it was non-toxic once it entered the bloodstream. They explicitly advised the Indian doctors that any treatment should focus only on the lungs and eyes. This was a lie, a catastrophic, deadly lie. Union Carbide knew from its own internal animal testing in West Virginia that MIC was not just an irritant, it was a systemic poison. They knew it broke down in the body, releasing cyanide into the bloodstream. The symptoms the Bhopal doctors were seeing, the cherry red blood, the convulsions, the rapid death, were classic signs of mass cyanide poisoning. The antidote for cyanide poisoning is a simple, cheap, and widely available chemical, sodium thiosulfate. An injection of this compound immediately neutralizes cyanide, pulling it from the cells and allowing the body to breathe again. The doctors in Bhopal, seeing the cyanide symptoms, suspected this. They wanted to administer sodium thiosulfate, but Union Carbide's medical officers flatly and officially advised against it. In public statements and in medical bulletins, they repeated the mantra, MIC is not a systemic poison. Cyanide is not involved. Do not, they warned, administer sodium thiosulfate, claiming it was unproven and dangerous. Why? The motives remain a subject of intense debate. To admit to cyanide poisoning was to admit that the gas leak was infinitely more complex and deadly than a simple irritant. It would open a legal Pandora's box, proving the company not only knew how lethal MIC was, but that it also produced other deadly gases, like hydrogen cyanide, in the reaction. It would expose their own internal toxicology reports, which they had kept secret for years. So they kept quiet. They chose to protect their legal case over the lives of the thousands who were still dying. This medical malpractice was reinforced by the Indian government's own chaotic bureaucracy. The central government, desperate to avoid panic and trusting the word of the powerful American multinational, initially sided with Union Carbide. They, too, advised against the sodium thiosulfate treatment. But a few brave doctors in Bhopal, led by Dr. Hiresh Chandra, the chief medical examiner, defied the official story. Dr. Chandra, as he performed hundreds of autopsies, saw the proof with his own eyes. The organs of the victims were bright pink. Their blood was filled with cyanide. He began to scream to anyone who would listen, "This is cyanide. We must give them the antidote." A courageous few began to administer it in secret, and a miracle happened. Patients who were moments from death, convulsing and suffocating, suddenly stabilized. They began to breathe. It was working. When the news of this success reached the government, Instead of ordering a mass injection campaign, they sent police to raid the clinics. They confiscated the sodium thiosulfate. The state, in lockstep with the corporation, preferred to let its citizens die rather than contradict the official narrative. This reaction, this combination of corporate lies, legal maneuvering, and government complicity cemented the tragedy. The disaster was not just the 2 hours of the gas leak. It was the months and years that followed, where the victims were denied the one simple medicine that could have saved them. The philanthropic response, when it finally came, was a continuation of this cynicism. Union Carbide, facing global outrage, eventually established a $470 million settlement fund in 1989 through an out-of-court deal with the Indian government. This deal was a stunning victory for the corporation. It represented a tiny fraction of their total assets. In exchange, the Indian government, acting as the sole representative of all victims, agreed to drop all future criminal and civil charges against the company and its executives. This was the ultimate expression of forum non-convenience. The settlement, when finally divided among the more than 500,000 victims, amounted to a pittance. After years of legal battles, most victims received between $500 and $2,000. It was enough money to cover perhaps a few years of medical bills. It was not justice, it was blood money, negotiated by a government that had failed its people and a corporation that had perfected the art of pricing human life. Amnesty International, in its 2024 report, noted the grim legacy. The long-term consequences, from cancers to birth defects, would plague over 150,000 people. The water in Bhopal remains poisoned with dioxins from the abandoned factory, and Dow Chemical, the company that bought UCC in 2001, has consistently refused any further responsibility, claiming the 1989 settlement was final. The corporate reaction from 1984 to the present day has been a resounding success. The company survived. The victims did not. The governance scandal and the legal wall. The tragedy of Bhopal was not limited to the night of the leak or the immediate chaotic response. The true, enduring scandal, the one that would define modern corporate malfeasance, was the cold, systematic, and deliberate campaign of governance failure, an abuse of responsibility that began in the hours after the disaster and continues to this day. This was not a story of panic or incompetence. It was a story of calculated boardroom-level decisions designed to protect the parent corporation at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing justice, truth, and the future of 500,000 people. The first act of this new scandal was the cover-up. In the days following the leak, as Warren Anderson was being whisked to safety, Union Carbide's American headquarters in Danbury, Connecticut, went into legal lockdown. A team of lawyers, not scientists, took control of the information flow. Their primary objective was not to understand what had happened, but to control the narrative of what had happened. This meant seizing, controlling, and where necessary, destroying the evidence. According to later testimony from Indian investigators and former UCIL employees, key documents at the Bhopal plant vanished. Maintenance logbooks that detailed the months of non-existent repairs on Tank 610 disappeared. Operator logs from the night of the disaster, which would have shown the precise timeline of the water leak and the broken gauges, were reported lost or damaged. The 1982 safety audit, the one that had predicted the disaster, was immediately classified as a privileged legal document, shielded from public view. This was not just the panic of local managers. This was a coordinated strategy. While UCC's American team was locking down evidence, they were simultaneously launching their sabotage theory. This governance scandal was twofold. First, they actively concealed the evidence of their own negligence, and second, they fabricated a false narrative to fill the vacuum. They accused an imaginary employee of a crime they knew their own cost-cutting had made inevitable. But the cornerstone of this abusive strategy was a legal argument, a masterpiece of corporate architecture known as the legal firewall. From the moment the first lawsuits were filed in the United States, Union Carbide's lawyers argued that Union Carbide Corporation, the $9 billion American parent, had no responsibility for the events in Bhopal. The blame, they insisted, lay solely with Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL. This was the ultimate abuse of governance. UCC, the American corporation, owned 51% of UCIL. It had designed the plant. It had chosen the inferior manual technology. It had exported the West Virginia operating manuals, which it knew didn't match the Bhopal equipment. It had sent its own American safety team to conduct the 1982 audit. It had received that audit in its Danbury headquarters. And it was Danbury that had ultimate control over the budget and the cost-cutting directives that had crippled the plant. But in court, none of that mattered. The company argued that UCIL was a separate, autonomous, and independent entity managed and operated entirely by Indians in India under Indian law. They painted a picture of a hands-off parent company that had merely invested in a foreign operation, like a distant stockholder. This was the same tactic they had perfected during the asbestos litigation, creating a labyrinth of subsidiaries to absorb liability and protect the parent's assets. This legal strategy culminated in the pivotal 1986 ruling by U.S. District Judge John F. Keenan. The victims' lawyers had argued powerfully that the case must be tried in America. The decisions, they said, were made in Danbury. The design was American. The parent company was American. They argued that the Indian legal system, overwhelmed and under-resourced, was incapable of handling a discovery process against one of the world's largest multinationals. Judge Keenan disagreed. In a decision that would become one of the most infamous in legal history, he dismissed the U.S. cases on the grounds of forum nonconvenience. He ruled that India was the more convenient place for the trial. He accepted Union Carbide's argument, effectively siding with the corporation that the American parent company was off the hook. He transferred the entire legal battle to the Indian courts, the very system he knew, and UCC's lawyers knew, could not cope. This was not just a legal ruling. It was a state-sanctioned abuse of responsibility. It was the American legal system telling a U.S. corporation that it was free to commit mass homicide abroad, as long as it did so through a foreign subsidiary. The governance scandal was complete. The company had successfully used its own corporate structure as both the murder weapon and the legal shield. Judge Keenan's ruling was the first half of the governance scandal. It was the American system washing its hands of the crime. The second and perhaps more insidious half of the scandal was perpetrated by the Indian government itself. Faced with this legal and humanitarian catastrophe, a legal case of unprecedented complexity and 500,000 victims demanding answers, the Indian government's response was not to facilitate justice. It was to seize control of it. In 1985, the Indian Parliament passed a new law, the Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Processing of Claims Act. This law, on its surface, seemed paternalistic, even noble. It appointed the central government as the parens patriae, a Latin term meaning parent of the nation. In this role, the government gave itself the sole, exclusive, and absolute power to represent every single victim of the disaster. It was a catastrophic abuse of power. With the stroke of a pen, the Indian government stripped every victim of their individual right to legal action. A survivor could no longer hire their own lawyer. A widow could no longer file her own suit. A group of victims could not band together to reject a settlement. Their voices were legally silenced. Their fate was placed entirely in the hands of the very same bureaucratic state that had, for years, taken Union Carbide's money, ignored the union's warnings, and dismissed the articles of the journalist Rajkumar Keswani. This created a conflict of interest so vast it was almost surreal. The Indian government, which had failed to regulate the plant and was therefore a clear co-defendant in the tragedy, had just appointed itself as the chief prosecutor for the victims. The fox was not just guarding the henhouse. It had just passed a law declaring itself the only lawyer the chickens were allowed to have. This governance failure set the stage for the final betrayal, the 1989 settlement. With the victims legally muzzled by the Bhopal Act, the Indian government and Union Carbide were free to negotiate behind closed doors. The victims were not in the room. Their lawyers were not in the room. It was a negotiation between two parties who both had a powerful interest in making the problem go away quickly and quietly. The resulting deal was a stunning victory for Union Carbide and a devastating final blow to the survivors. The corporation agreed to pay $470 million. In exchange, the Indian government agreed to drop every civil and criminal claim against the company, its executives, and its subsidiaries forever. To the world, $470 million sounded like a large sum. To the victims and to the lawyers who understood the scale of the damage, it was a joke. The original lawsuits filed in the U.S. had sought billions. Union Carbide's own insurance policy at the time was for over $200 million, and its total assets were nearly $10 billion. The settlement was a tiny fraction of the company's worth, and a rounding error compared to the damage. When divided among the 500,000 known victims, it amounted to just a few $100s per person. It was not enough to cover the medical bills for even a single year, let alone a lifetime of chronic illness. But the most scandalous part of the deal was the fine print. In exchange for this blood money, the Indian government agreed to quash all criminal charges against Warren Anderson and the other executives. The governance failure was complete. The Indian Supreme Court, in a final act of judicial betrayal, upheld this settlement. The state had not just failed to protect its people from the gas, it had now actively and legally sold their right to justice for pennies on the dollar. This was the true lasting scandal. It was a fix between two powerful entities, the corporation and the state, who had found a way to close the books on the world's worst industrial disaster. The victims, blinded, sick, and now legally powerless, were left with nothing but a bureaucratic nightmare of forms to fill out, just to claim their tiny insulting share of the money that had been traded for their silence. The 1989 settlement was meant to be the end of the story. It was a full and final deal, rubber-stamped by the Indian Supreme Court. For Union Carbide's governance model, it was a spectacular success. But for the victims and the activists who fought with them, the scandal had only just entered a new, more cynical phase, the fight for criminal justice. The civil case was closed, but the criminal case, in the eyes of the Indian public, remained wide open. The settlement had been so unpopular, so widely condemned as a sellout, that the Indian Supreme Court was forced to backtrack. In 1991, facing immense public pressure, the court reopened the criminal charges against Warren Anderson and Union Carbide. The governance scandal now shifted from a corporate cover-up to a geopolitical farce. India's Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, formally charged Warren Anderson, Union Carbide Corporation, USA, and its Asian subsidiary with culpable homicide. An arrest warrant was issued. The Indian government, the same entity that had accepted the $470 million deal, now formally requested that the United States government extradite Warren Anderson to India to stand trial for manslaughter. What followed was a decades-long abuse of international protocols. The U.S. government received the extradition request, and then it did nothing. For more than 20 years, from 1991 until Anderson's death in 2014, the United States Department of Justice and the State Department engaged in a masterclass of bureaucratic stonewalling. They lost the paperwork. They claimed the request was not properly formatted. They sent back queries for more information, which, when answered, were met with more silence. This was not a failure of governance. It was a deliberate policy of governance. Warren Anderson was not a rogue CEO. He was the head of a critical American multinational, a key player in the chemical industry, and a symbol of American corporate power. The U.S. government had no intention of ever handing over a man of his stature to a foreign court, especially not one in the developing world, for a crime committed in the pursuit of profit. The two governments, which had colluded on Anderson's release in 1984, were now engaged in a quiet, polite diplomatic dance to ensure he would die a free man in his comfortable Florida home. While Anderson was protected in the U.S., the criminal case in India descended into a tragic comedy. With the main defendant missing, the case against the Indian-based UCIL executives dragged on for over 2 decades. Finally, in 2010, a local Bhopal court delivered its verdict. 8 low-level elderly Indian managers, all in their 70s, were found guilty of death by negligence. Their sentence, for their role in the world's worst industrial disaster, was 2 years in prison and a fine of $2,000. They were all released on bail almost immediately and never spent a single night in jail. It was the final insulting punchline to the entire governance scandal. The American CEO who ran the corporation, the man who knew of the 1982 audit and approved the cost-cutting, was protected by his government. The Indian government, having sold out the victims in the civil suit, had now delivered a criminal conviction that was utterly meaningless. The system had protected itself, its executives, and its corporate allies, while sacrificing only a few low-level elderly Indian employees as scapegoats. This entire framework of impunity was made possible by one final massive scandal: the acquisition by Dow Chemical. In 2001, Dow Chemical purchased Union Carbide for $9.3 billion. In doing so, it absorbed all of UCC's assets and, according to all international legal standards, all of its liabilities. The victims and activists saw a new opportunity. Dow was a visible, public-facing American company. Surely they would be more sensitive to public pressure. Dow's response was to adopt and perfect Union Carbide's playbook. From day one, Dow's legal department insisted that the 1989 settlement was full and final. They claimed that when they bought UCC, they only bought its assets, not its liabilities, a legal argument that has been repeatedly rejected by courts. Dow's lawyers have consistently refused to appear in Indian courts to answer the criminal charges still pending against their subsidiary, Union Carbide. They have refused point blank to pay for the environmental cleanup of the factory site, which to this day continues to poison the groundwater of Bhopal with dioxins and heavy metals. A Greenpeace study from 2004 found lead and mercury in the local water supply at levels thousands of times higher than WHO safety limits. Dow's position is that the cleanup is the responsibility of the Indian state, not the corporation that created the toxic dump. The governance scandal, therefore, has no end. It is a perfect, self-perpetuating machine. It began with UCC's board knowingly cutting safety to save money. It continued with the American legal system protecting the parent company. It was aided by the Indian government's cynical decision to seize control of the claims. And it is now maintained by Dow Chemical, a corporation that has successfully laundered Union Carbide's assets, hidden its own liability, and continues to deny any responsibility for the poison that still flows through the water and the veins of the people of Bhopal, the fate of Anderson, and the disappearance of Union Carbide. While the governance scandals played out on a global stage, a different, more personal drama was unfolding. For the 500,000 victims, the tragedy was a daily grinding reality. It was the personal tragedy of children, born with cleft palates and missing limbs. It was the tragedy of families watching their parents waste away from pulmonary fibrosis. It was the tragedy of drinking poisoned water because there was no other choice. But on the other side of the world, in the insulated enclaves of American corporate power, a different kind of tragedy was taking place. The personal downfall of its CEO and the dissolution of the corporation he once ran. The story of Warren Anderson is the ultimate case study in the personal impunity of the modern executive. He is perhaps the only man in history to be the wanted fugitive of a mass casualty crime while simultaneously living a life of affluent obscurity. Anderson's tragedy was not one of suffering, it was one of inconvenience. After his 6-hour arrest and miraculous state-sponsored escape from Bhopal in December 1984, he returned to Danbury, Connecticut, not as a pariah, but as a leader who had survived a difficult business trip. He resumed his role as chairman and CEO. For the next 2 years, he continued to run Union Carbide, steering the company through the initial storm of lawsuits and managing the public relations campaign that would invent the sabotage theory. His leadership, however, was now singularly focused. It was not on innovation or growth, but on survival. The corporation was under siege, both from litigants and from corporate raiders who saw the disaster as an opportunity to buy the company's assets for pennies on the dollar. Anderson's primary personal challenge was not a crisis of conscience. It was a crisis of finance. In 1986, under immense pressure from the board and the financial markets, Warren Anderson stepped down as CEO. He officially retired, a wealthy man, his golden parachute secure. He had successfully navigated the immediate fallout, set the legal strategy in motion, and passed the baton. But as the Indian government's extradition requests slowly began to gain traction in the early 1990s, Anderson's life changed. He could no longer be a public figure. He became a ghost. He disappeared from the exclusive country clubs of Connecticut and vanished into a life of protected anonymity. He retreated to a sprawling waterfront home in a gated community in Vero Beach, Florida. He spent his days playing golf and tending his garden, shielded by a labyrinth of private security and corporate lawyers. The Indian government and the activists who hounded him knew exactly where he was. Journalists would periodically show up at his gates shouting questions, only to be chased away by private guards. He was a prisoner in his own $1 million paradise. This was the personal tragedy of Warren Anderson. He was not haunted by the faces of the dead. He was inconvenienced by the persistence of the living. His name became synonymous with corporate evil, a bogeyman for activists who, on the anniversary of the disaster, would burn him in effigy outside the abandoned toxic factory. He became the human face of a faceless crime, the one man upon whom the world could focus its rage, yet he remained utterly untouchable. The U.S. government as his silent protector, ensured that the extradition request would never be served. His personal tragedy was that he had to live out his retirement in luxury, but in the shadows, unable to give a speech or have his name on a university building. When he finally died in 2014 at the age of 92, his death was as quiet as his hidden life. His family did not announce it for over a month. The New York Times, in his obituary, noted the stark contrast. The man responsible for the world's worst industrial disaster had died peacefully in a Florida nursing home, thousands of miles from the scene of his crime, having never spent a single day in court. While Warren Anderson retreated into his personal private exile, the corporation he had abandoned was fighting for its life. The personal tragedies of the executives were matters of reputation. The tragedy of Union Carbide itself was a matter of finance. The Bhopal disaster had not just stained the company's name, it had made it a wounded animal, bleeding money, and the sharks of Wall Street began to circle. The corporation's immediate problem was not just the Bhopal lawsuits, it was a hostile takeover. Just months after the disaster in 1985, a corporate raider named Samuel J. Heyman, who ran the GAF Corporation, launched an audacious hostile bid to buy Union Carbide. Heyman's strategy was brutal and simple. He saw that UCC's stock price had plummeted. He knew the company was vulnerable, and he knew that its diverse portfolio of assets, its batteries, its chemicals, its plastics divisions, were worth far more separately than they were as a combined tainted entity. He intended to buy the company cheap, break it into pieces, and sell those pieces for a massive profit. This was the ultimate personal tragedy for the old guard of Union Carbide. The company that had survived Hawk's Nest, that had pioneered the chemical age, was now being treated as a carcass to be butchered. The board, now free of Anderson, fought back with the only tools it had. To fend off Heyman's raid, they initiated a desperate, scorched earth defense. They took on massive crushing debt, billions of dollars, to buy back their own stock at an inflated price, making the company less attractive to a raider. But this debt, taken on to win a battle on Wall Street, sealed their fate. Union Carbide, which had entered 1984 with a manageable $2 billion debt, was now drowning in over $3.5 billion of new high-interest junk debt. The company had saved itself from a takeover, but it had signed its own death warrant. Now it had to pay. The dissolution of the empire began. The board was forced to do exactly what the corporate raider had intended. They had to sell their crown jewels one by one to service the crushing debt. The first and most painful sale came in 1986. They sold the division that had been the public face of the company for nearly a century, the Eveready Battery Division. The iconic brand with its 9-lived cat was sold to Ralston Purina. This was not just a financial transaction, it was a psychological severing. The friendly, consumer-facing side of Union Carbide was gone. Next, in the same year, they sold the very division that had caused the disaster, the Agricultural Products Division. The Savine brand, the entire pesticide and myc-related business, was sold off to the French chemical giant Rhone Poulenc. It was a desperate attempt to cut the cancer out, to distance the parent company from the very product that was destroying it. The internal disputes were tearing the company apart. Shareholders, furious at the collapse of their stock value and the board's reckless accumulation of debt, filed their own lawsuits. In a 1985 Delaware court case, the company was forced to reckon with its own investors, who argued that the board's negligence in Bhopal and its reckless defense against the takeover had destroyed their equity. The company that was fighting the victims in India was now also fighting its own owners in America. What was left of Union Carbide was a hollow shell. It was no longer a diversified, dominant conglomerate. It was a struggling, deeply indebted commodity chemical producer, stripped of its best assets and its public identity. This hobbled, debt-ridden ghost limped through the 1990s, a pariah of the industrial world. Its name was toxic. Its finances were a wreck. It was only a matter of time. The end came in 2001. In a final ignominious chapter, the remains of Union Carbide were purchased by its longtime rival, Dow Chemical, for $9.3 billion. The press releases from Dow celebrated the merger as a synergistic combination of two great American companies. But it was not a merger. It was an absorption. Dow Chemical, in its first act as the new owner, did what no lawsuit or activist group had ever managed to do. It erased the Union Carbide name. The stock ticker was delisted. The logos were removed. The letterhead was destroyed. The corporation known as Union Carbide, the titan of the 20th century, the pioneer of chemistry, and the perpetrator of the world's worst industrial disaster, officially ceased to exist. This corporate dissolution was the final personal tragedy for the company's legacy. But for Dow, it was a business tactic. They had acquired Carbide's remaining profitable assets, its technologies, and its market share. And in the process, they had also acquired its single greatest liability, Bhopal. Dow's public response was immediate and has remained unchanged for over 2 decades. They claim that they, as Dow, have no responsibility for Bhopal. They argue that the 1989 settlement was final. They insist that the criminal and civil liabilities belong to Union Carbide, a company that, conveniently, no longer exists. This was the final dissolution, the dissolution of accountability itself. The corporate shell game, perfected by UCC with its asbestos subsidiaries, had been completed. The name Union Carbide was gone, but its toxic legacy, its poisoned land, and its legal obligations were now buried deep inside the balance sheet of its rival, a rival that would use its own massive legal and political power to ensure the victims of Bhopal would never see another cent. The personal tragedies of the victims were permanent, but the corporation responsible for them had simply vanished. In the wake of a tragedy as vast as Bhopal, conspiracy theories were inevitable, growing from the seeds of corporate secrecy and geopolitical tension. The most potent and persistent, heavily promoted by Union Carbide itself, was the sabotage theory, the claim that a single disgruntled employee had intentionally flooded the tank. Though repeatedly debunked by Indian government investigations, this narrative served its purpose, muddying the waters and shifting the debate from systemic negligence to a solvable individual crime. Other theories festered in the information vacuum. Rumors of plots by corporate rivals, or even as noted in later WikiLeaks cables, allegations of CIA intervention to pressure the Indian government for Warren Anderson's release in 1984. But the true global influence of Union Carbide was not in these shadow government plots. Its real, undeniable influence is written in the law books of the world. The Bhopal disaster was a watershed moment, a brutal lesson that forced a global reckoning with corporate accountability. It was the direct catalyst for India's Bhopal Act, a radical law empowering the state to sue on behalf of its citizens. In the United States, it fueled the passage of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, forcing companies for the first time to disclose the toxic chemicals they were storing. It directly influenced the UN Global Compact and the rise of modern corporate social responsibility, creating the legal and moral framework by which corporations are judged today. Ultimately, Historians and organizations like Amnesty International dismiss the conspiracy theories, focusing instead on the documented systemic failure. The true horror of Bhopal was not a secret plot. It was a mundane, bureaucratic, and entirely predictable result of corporate cost-cutting. The legacy of Union Carbide is not a mystery to be solved. It is a terrible, clear, and enduring lesson, a lesson in the complex power dynamic between multinational profit and human safety, a lesson that was paid for in full by the people of Bhopal